عرض لكتاب لاسبيل إلى غزة، سجل المغامرة والاحتيال تحت الحصار المصري، لمؤلفه رودريغو كامبوس، كاتب برازيلي يحضر لدرجة الدكتوراه في العلوم السياسية في جامعة يورك، منتج أفلام وثائقية وناشط حقوقي وإنساني. شارك تأليف هذا الكتاب مع الأكاديميين البرازيليين خيناتو كوستا ولوكاس جياز. يتحدث الكتاب عن محاولات المؤلفين الفاشلة لقطع شبه جزيرة سيناء من أجل الوصول إلى قطاع غزة لتصوير فيلم وثائقي.
Hi everyone, my name is Rodrigo Campos. I am from Brazil. I am currently doing a PhD in politics at the University of York, and I am also a documentary filmmaker. I'm here to talk with you today about this book that I have just co-authored. It's called No Way to Gaza, A Chronicle of Adventure and Fraud Under the Egyptian Blockade. I have published this book with two dear friends of mine from Brazil, Renato Costa, who is a professor of international relations at the Federal University of Pampa in South Brazil, and Lucas Dias, who is a songwriter and has a degree in international relations by the same university, also in South Brazil. And this book has been just published by the Middle East Monitor, which is a UK publishing house. And so I'm going to talk through a little bit with you today about the story behind the book, the context of why we wrote it, and why do we think it has an important political message in terms of the Palestinian struggle to self-determination. So this book is about our failed attempt to cross the Sinai Peninsula in order to get into Gaza, the Gaza Strip, to film a documentary about life of the people living there in the Gaza Strip. Now, the reason why this project failed was not so much due to bad luck or even to wrong coincidences, although of course this did play a part. I think it went far beyond it. The reason why it was a failure, this project, was because on the first half of our trip through Egypt, we got entangled in this Kafkaesque Egyptian bureaucratic nightmare as we were trying to use our permits and our authorizations to cross the military checkpoints, starting from the Suez Canal, through the Sinai Peninsula, and finally in the Rafah crossing so that we can go into Gaza. That didn't work out very well, so we got entangled in this bureaucratic nightmare, still in Cairo, before we could even reach the Sinai Peninsula. But it really got dangerous, and we call it a dangerous adventure, when we finally managed to pierce through the blockade of the military checkpoints, and we got into the Sinai Peninsula. And you know, the Sinai, over the last 10 years maybe, has been a devastated region. The peninsula has been under siege, and this has been intensified with a lot of human rights violations perpetrated by President Sisi's regime. He has been fighting a dubious and very costly war on terrorism in that region. So it's a region that has been completely blacked out. The media has no access to it. You see a lot of reports from international organizations regarding human rights violations, and these vary from torture to even psychological harassment, demolition of homes of the Bedouin population that lives in the Sinai Peninsula, forced disappearance, basically crushing the opposition to Sisi's regime. And so it's really a state of exception that has been going on in the Sinai Peninsula over the last years. And somehow we were able to cross that region in order to go to Gaza. But that's also where things got really dangerous and a bit bizarre as well for us as, filmmakers trying to tell the story of Palestinians that have to use this route daily to either enter or exit the Gaza Strip, as they have no other alternative. Because as we know, the Erez crossing, which is controlled by Israel, is really difficult for Palestinians to leave or enter Gaza through that crossing. So sometimes for common people and for Palestinians who have to leave Gaza for medical treatment or even for medical supplies to go into the Strip, they only have the Egyptian route as alternative. And so this really became a dangerous adventure in the Sinai Peninsula for us. It nearly cost our lives. One of our friends, Fabio, we were originally a four-member crew for this documentary that we were planning. Fabio had a stroke still when we were in Cairo, so before we could even cross the Suez Canal. And this was, the result of heightened distress, all of the insane things that the Egyptian authorities made us do so that we could finally cross into the Sinai. And after, when we finally managed to cross it there, Fabio had to go back to Brazil already. And we, the three of us, myself, Renato, and Lucas, we were constantly harassed, both psychologically and physically. There was a point where we got arrested in Al Arish, which is a town about 100 kilometers to Rafah, and we were home arrested in a hotel. And so, this situation was really distressing for us. And I'm here to talk a little bit about this story, about this chronicle, our saga to go to Gaza. But I think beyond our own experience, I think really the message that the book tries to convey is that this is a reality that Palestinians have to endure daily, in their task to either enter or exit the Gaza Strip using the Egyptian route. So everything that happened to us was actually reflected, what Palestinians are used to daily when they use this route. And, we know as a fact that the blockade of Gaza is perpetrated by Israel with the aid of the Egyptian military and Egyptian intelligence operations. But I think what we were able to apprehend or to understand from this journey is that the mechanisms of this blockade, they stretch far beyond what we conventionally know about the blockade of Gaza. So I think this is what the story that the book portrays. I think also from the point of view as researchers, what really motivated us was that in recent years, if we take the story of the Palestinian struggle, at least since 2010, things appear to have worsened a lot over the past couple of years. If we take, for instance, the Israeli military aggression on the Gaza Strip alone, from 2008 until 2018 or 19, this is data from an Israeli human rights organization called B'Tselem. The Israeli aggression has taken the lives of over 4,200 Palestinians against 51 Israelis that were killed in the Gaza Strip during that period. So we're talking about a killing ratio of 1 Israeli to every 87 Palestinians. Out of this number, so 4,200, a bit over that actually, half of the victims were actually civilians that were not involved in the confrontations. And out of this number, out of this civilian casualties, we have a staggering 40%, so over 1,000 people were children, so unarmed and children who were killed by Israeli security forces. So it's not really a conflict that we're talking about, it's really a massacre perpetrated by Israel with its settler colonial project, which it has been able to impose unlawfully while the so-called international community conveniently blinds its eye to it. And we wanted to report on that situation because also in Gaza, whenever there is an escalation of military aggression against Palestinians, that's when Palestinians that live there usually have to use the Rafah crossing, the Egyptian exit, as an alternative to get medical assistance or to get, basic goods, basic medical supplies into Gaza. And over the last years, with Sisi's regime, and I would say Sisi's dictatorship, this is precisely when the Egyptians have controlled and have tightened their grip in the Rafah crossing, not allowing Palestinians to leave that's when Egyptians control, that's when they tighten the noose on Palestinians so that they do not leave the territory, the enclave. So this was a story that we were about to tell, but of course there's a bigger context into it. We know recently there's a lot of talk about the normalization of relationship between Arab countries and Israel. If we zoom out of the Middle East a bit and we see, for instance, Israel in this dangerous policy of rapprochement with far-right parties in the whole world, and this is also true to Brazil. We currently have this proto-fascist president in Brazil called Jair Bolsonaro. He has been very keen on destroying the whole legacy of Brazilian diplomacy and the expression of solidarity towards the Palestinian people. With Lula's government, for instance, under the Workers' Party, Brazil opened officially a Palestinian embassy in Brazil, and this has been completely demolished. Bolsonaro has aligned with the most nefastous Zionist ideology possible. So to us, this was actually also, we felt the need to tell this story. So enough about the context, what motivated us. I want to talk a little bit about the content of this book. So our book has 7 chapters alongside the introduction. The introduction is gives more political and historical insight into what has been happening recently in Gaza, as I said, but also in Egyptian history, because we know since 2013 there has been a military coup that ousted Egypt's first democratically elected president, Mohamed Morsi. Sisi took over, and that's when things began to get worse for Palestinians. They were continuously seen as associated with radical organizations, and that was a justification for Sisi to tighten its grip over the Gaza Strip as well. The other chapters, they are divided into 2 large parts, if I can divide it this way. So the first one is the whole idea behind the project, how we organized the trip, and our arrival into Cairo, and our first attempt to cross into the Sinai Peninsula so that we could travel all the way to Rafah. Now, what happened there was we had all the authorization that we needed to travel through the Sinai Peninsula and into Gaza. And this may be actually quite surprising because, as I said, the Sinai has been under a media blackout for quite some time. So when we requested to the Egyptian embassy in Brazil, they asked us to go after a pile of paperwork, which we did, and eventually they granted us not only a special visa with multiple entries, but also they provided us, and we still have it in our passports, we show it here in the book, they gave us a special security protocol which would allow us, would give us clearance to go into the Gaza Strip. So this was really an odd situation where we had all the paperwork necessary, and yet we were continuously denied access into the Sinai and after into Rafah. It took us 3 attempts before we could finally enter the Sinai Peninsula. We had planned initially to stay about a day in Cairo, 30 days in Gaza, and it turned out that we spent 20 days in Cairo trying to circumvent this, this situation, this very bureaucratic nightmare, as I said, because the soldiers at the military checkpoint, they simply didn't care about the clearance that we had, about the visas, the special visas that we had. They just denied us passage and told us to go back to Cairo. And so it took us 20 days, and it also nearly cost the life of a friend who had a stroke, as I said before, given the heightened, distressful situation in which we were. And he went back to Brazil, and about 2 days after, that's on our third attempt to cross the military checkpoint in the region of Ismailia. That's when you cross the Suez Canal, and that's when you enter the Sinai Peninsula. We then finally, and we have no idea how, we were able to enter the place. And as soon as you get into Sinai, that's when things start to get really ugly and scary. The landscape changes dramatically. It becomes very graphic in terms of the whole militarization of the region. You see different types of security forces that ranges from foot soldiers to masked militias, and they're all wielding heavy equipment. You see a lot of military tanks everywhere in the Sinai. And, you know, some bizarre things happened to us. We were supposed to spend only one night in Al Arish as soon as we got into Sinai. And then the next day we would go straight into the Gaza Strip, our final destination. And we had a lot of people from the Islamic University of Gaza. There was a whole delegation waiting for us in Gaza. And the first night that we arrived in the Sinai, just before we entered Al Arish, the town of Al Arish, where we would spend the night, we were stopped in this massive queue. There was a huge convoy taking Palestinians into Gaza, and we spent about 3 hours in the military checkpoint waiting for our turn to have clearance and to have our luggage checked. And what happened was that at some stage there was an explosion quite far away, and that really made everyone tense, not only us, but also Palestinians who were there and are even used to that situation. And as soon as we got into the checkpoint, this Egyptian soldier, he was really young, probably 18 years old, he came up to me inside the car. He asked for my passport and also my friend's passport. And he was translating, our driver was translating what the Egyptian soldier was telling us. And he wanted my Palestinian passport, as he said. He did not believe I was Brazilian. So I showed him my Brazilian passport, and he just couldn't believe. He thought I was lying about my identity. The driver told me eventually that he was saying, the soldier was saying that I was a Palestinian spy in Egypt. And so it came to such an escalation of tension that eventually he dragged me out of the car, and other soldiers dragged forcefully my friends out of the car as well. They began, harassing us, and they even shot their AK-47s up into the sky to intimidate, as if we posed some kind of imminent danger. So that was really a scary situation. And afterwards, he just disappeared with our driver into this distant office they had improvised a couple of yards away. And our driver came back. He had to pay a bribe, about $100, so that we could go forward with our trip. And bribery, this is common for Palestinians that have to take this route. We heard many stories of Palestinians telling us that they have to take sometimes thousands of dollars, and they have to hide it in their socks, because you never know. You might have all the paperwork, but you will be harassed to such an extent with the Egyptian army that you will have to pay high amounts of bribery so that you can finally go back home into Gaza. We arrived then after that into Al Arish, and Al Arish maybe 15 years ago or more used to be this beautiful coastal town and facing the Mediterranean. It used to have wonderful beach resorts, and now with Sisi's war in that region, it's a city under siege. It literally looks like a city that is used as a stage for a war film. Everything is torn apart, everything is wrecked. There are military tanks spread everywhere in the city. You see very few people walking the streets because of the curfew. There are bullet holes sprayed absolutely everywhere in every single building. Buildings are demolished. And one of the taxi drivers next morning told us that this was all bombarded by the Egyptian army. So they could actually cite that the Egyptian jet fighters were bombarding the town of Al-Arish and also neighboring cities like Sheikh Zuyed and even Rafah. Rafah was completely demolished. You don't see a standing building as you pass through to the city, in the Egyptian side, of course. And, so the Sisi's project is basically to impose a reign of terror against the population there, but also to create a buffer zone, this geopolitical space separating Egypt to Gaza. And this comes in a time when Egypt has been much more aligned and cooperating militarily with Israel. So Egypt is just performing Israel's job to tighten its noose in the Gaza Strip. So, and I'm beginning to conclude now, because I also don't want to spoil it so much, all of the anecdotes, so that you have the chance, I hope, to read the book. The next day, we were able to finally get into Gaza, and after 20 days, completely exhausted, psychologically, but also physically, and after what had happened to us the last night at the military checkpoint, we thought, this was our redemption moment. We would finally get into Gaza, do our project as we had planned and as we were authorized to do according to Egyptian authorities. And we arrived early in the morning at the Rafah crossing, about 8 a.m. And it was only at about 4 p.m. that we heard news that an Egyptian general from the Sinai region, he denied us passage, giving us absolutely no justification to it. We were simply denied passage after all we had gone through. And what happened was that we got kicked out of the Rafah crossing. We had to go back to Al-Arish. And this was such a bad coincidence. This happened at the same day when former President Morsi died in Cairo during a trial, during his trial in Cairo. And what happened was that the political tension was so heightened that night that when we got back to Al-Arish, we were actually home arrested in the hotel where we were staying. We were not allowed to leave the hotel room, and we had to wait until the next day. The next day, they had arranged this scandalous security operation to evacuate us, to deport us away from the Sinai region back into Cairo, and that's how, unfortunately, our adventure, our dangerous adventure, ended, and we had to go back to Brazil. But I think, I've been telling you these anecdotes about what happened to us, but I think the biggest message is that everything that we went through was not nearly as bad as what Palestinians have to endure daily when they use the Egyptian route. And we heard so many stories that, of course, you can read in the book. We interviewed a lot of Palestinians that are used to this. One of the Palestinians with whom we spoke to in the region of Ismailia, he said that he had just arrived in Cairo and he was kept with his family in an underground room at the Cairo International Airport. And he was kept there for a couple of days before he was allowed, finally, he got clearance to go into Gaza. So these are just some of the stories, amazing stories that Palestinians tell us of what they have to endure when they want to go back home. I hope you have enjoyed learning about this book. I hope you do have a chance to read it. And yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.